Well, welcome everyone to our 2021 um, Constitution Day week and also National Voter Registration Day. Today is National Voter Registration Day. We will speak to that a bit later. This is the latest collaboration between the Texas A&M University Libraries Diversity Advancement Committee and the University Constitution Week Committee, of which I'm the library's representative. And our event today as a panel celebrating 50 years of voting at 18, which is the 50th anniversary of the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Before we introduce our guest speakers, we want to just give a land acknowledgement that we acknowledge that Texas A&M University College Station is situated on the land of multiple Native nations, past and present. These original homelands are the territory of indigenous peoples who were largely dispossessed and removed. We specifically acknowledge the traditional stewardship of this land by the Tonkawa, Tabaconi, Waco, Sana, Wichita, and Coatecan peoples. We pledge to support and advocate for the histories, cultures, languages, and territorial rights of historic indigenous peoples of Texas and the indigenous peoples that live here now. This statement affirms the continuous indigenous presence and rights, acknowledges the ongoing effects of settler colonization, and supports indigenous struggles for political, legal, and cultural sovereignty. Also, for this event, we have community expectations for all participants that please silence your microphones, that to be respectful of others in the chat. If you do have questions, submit them in the chat to Marisol Moreno. We will hold them for the Q&A. Individuals who do not adhere to these conditions will be removed from the Zoom. So we have allocated approximately 45 minutes for our panelist discussion, and then the final 15 minutes for a Q&A. And now introducing our panelists. First, Dr. Kirby Goidel. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science at Texas A&M University. His research is motivated by questions of democratic governance, including whether citizens are up to the task of democratic governance, the willingness and ability of elites to manipulate public opinion, and the institutional mechanisms which translate democratic inputs into policy outcomes. His most recent project investigates how the public understands democracy and how those understanding influence political processes and outcomes. Our next panelist is Professor Meg Penrose from the Texas A&M University College of Law, or School of Law. I can't remember which one. Professor Penrose has been teaching constitutional law courses for over 20 years. She is a member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar and the American Law Institute. She currently serves as the law school's faculty liaison for judicial clerkships and a former Division I college athlete. Meg has qualified for and run the Boston Marathon twice. Wow. Kudos. And our final panelist is Dr. Billy Monroe. He's Associate Professor of Political Science in the Division of Social Sciences at Prairie View A&M University and serves as University Pre-Law Advisor. He received his PhD in Political Science from the University of Texas at Dallas in 2008. His research and teaching interests are in American politics, with an emphasis in constitutional law, law, and courts. So please, a silent, perhaps, round of applause for our panelists, and welcome, and welcome. So I'm going to start off with this observation that 50 years ago, the summer of 1971, kind of an extraordinary process happened. I think it's particularly extraordinary in today's climate, in that a the 26th Amendment was proposed and voted on by Congress, both houses of Congress, in March of 1971, and then by July 1st, it was ratified by 3/4 of the states, which seems like warp speed. So given that extraordinarily turnaround, um, it seems like it just happened instantaneous. But I would like the panelists to speak to the fact that in reality it had been decades in the making, and kind of give us how the history and development of the 26th Amendment happened, and how it may be similarly echoed in today's climate, political climate. So anyone who wants to begin on that, how do you feel about it, or give some more of the history? How did lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, seemed to happen quickly?
Well, I'm glad to jump in, but I think my co-panelists on this question are probably more informed about this than I am, but that won't stop me. It seems like it happened very quickly, but this was an idea that was floating around for some time, at least since World War II, and the idea that people who got drafted and who went to fought wars should not necessarily should be allowed to vote. If we're gonna draft people and send them to die, they should be allowed to vote. But you can see from World War II to 1971, that's 30 years of the idea sort of floating around. So it seems like it's quick in the moment, but it's really not. Now, as a sort of policy scholar, we often talk about windows of opportunity in policy, and that means that ideas are out there and they're floating, but it takes a certain set of events in order to make them happen, and especially to happen in this way. One of the leading scholars in this area, John Kingdon, says that the ideas are floating around in the primordial soup and until the window of opportunity opens. And so this opens in the 1970s with the events with the Vietnam protest, with the events at Kent State, with other things going on. And it happens both because there is a push from the left to say people deserve the right to vote and to participate, but there's also a recognition on the right that these people are protesting. Maybe we should just give them the vote so they don't protest so much. that may be a little bit overly cynical, but I think there's something to that. And so, when you look at sort of the last part of the question, when you look at today's climate, there's a lot of there's some similarities and some differences, and some of the differences reflect this idea that it's all about war and conflict, but there's also, I think, a recognition that there are a lot of young voters who are going to be affected by a lot of the bad decisions that our generations have been making, or by our inability to solve problems such as deficit, such as climate change, and so forth, and that these folks deserve a say, because in essence, we're either giving them policies that will need to be addressed more seriously in the future, or we're asking them to foot the bill for our decisions. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues jump in.
So I'll go ahead and jump in, because I agree. This all started really in 1942 during the World War II period, and there was a slogan, and the slogan was, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. And that really motivated a lot of Americans, because we were sending our young men off to war. And so during the 40s, this became a rallying cry. And in 1943, Georgia, outside of the amendment process, became the first state to lower the voting age to 18. And then President Eisenhower, in his 1954 State of the Union, actually made voting one of the issues that he addressed. And what he said is he wanted to see the voting age lowered. And so you are right in the sense that the having the proposal to the ratification seems like warp speed. But this was something decades in the making. And what really pushed this to the amendment process was in 1970, Congress entered the fray, not through an amendment process, but through the legislative process. And it made an amendment to the 1965 Voting Act. And one of the things it did was sought to lower the voting age to 18 years for all voters at the federal elections, state elections, local elections. Well, Texas was one of 4 states to challenge that law before the United States Supreme Court. So in a case called Oregon versus Mitchell, the United States Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision said, yes, Congress, you can legislatively set the age for federal elections, but you cannot legislatively set the age for state elections. That has to be something either states themselves do, or we do it through the amendment process. And as soon as that decision came down, that is when you saw everything move from the legislature in its traditional lawmaking sense, from the United States Supreme Court, it went back to Congress. The Senate unanimously agreed to lower the voting age. And it's also received overwhelming support in the House of Representatives. So historically, it's a really important amendment. But something else that a lot of people don't think about is this is the last amendment that has been debated in the 20th century. The 27th Amendment was actually proposed in the 18th century, right? So it's that last amendment, but this is the most recent amendment. We as a democratic society have come together and coalesced around something. And that started with that whole slogan, old enough to fight, old enough to vote.
I just wanted to add a little piece to it that I found interesting as I was reading the literature. The issue, at least from a practical sense, was after Oregon versus Mitchell was, oh my gosh, we're going to have 2 voting rolls, one for federal and one in state and local, and the cost and the inefficiency. And that's what led a lot of the states to go, okay, let's go through the amendment process and get it done quickly, because we now have a 72 election coming up.
Well, and so that's great, because it kind of leads into the next section that's sort of in that climate of 1971. You had so in effect the voting age changed in the summer, mid-year, in time for the fall elections, but it was not a huge election year compared to 1972. So 1972 was a presidential election year. And so that was really the first big federal election, which was won by Richard Nixon, re-election, in a huge landslide. So from that ratification in summer of 1971 to the fall of 1972, I mean, was there a sense of a huge change and impact, or has that kind of developed over time?
I mean, I think the response was immediate, because there were a lot of issues that were impacting that group of voters. And so we consider the youth vote to be 18 to 29, even though, we're talking about adding those 2 extra years from 18 to 20. And in the election in 1972, that is one of the highest, if not the highest, percentage of the youth we've ever seen vote. 55% of individuals in that age bracket voted. So I think that the issues at the time really spoke to them, perhaps just the motivation. Now you have the opportunity to vote, so now you want to register and move forward. To give some perspective, in the 2014 elections, 20% of individuals between 18 and 29 voted. That's a pretty small figure. But then when we got to 2018, so one of our more recent elections, we had 36% of voters in that age range. So, I mean, I think increasingly it's a voice that can be heard, should be heard, but they're not necessarily the most consistent voting bloc.
Yeah, so when we think about sort of impact, I like to think about the two factors that go together. One of them is how large is the voter turnout among a particular group. That tells us how much of an impact they can have. And then second, how consistently do they, or how do they vote as a bloc? Or how divided are they in terms of their voting behavior? So one of the things that was sort of surprising after the 18 to 20-year-old group was given the right to vote is that they didn't always vote as clearly as a bloc as we might have expected. And so there was more division there. So even if they did turn out at a high rate, they weren't as identifiable as a bloc as some other groups that we might think about. And so the demands that they placed on government for policy demands weren't as clear. So when we think, for example, about older voters, voting on the basis of Social Security or on the basis of programs that affect older voters, they have a clear voice and they have a clear impact in terms of policy. For younger voters, that hasn't always been the case because they've often been divided in terms of their preferences, and we can go back. They're also often a couple of other things. They're often motivated by short-term factors. So this variance that Dr. Penrose was talking about is important, but because when young voters turn out at a high rate, oftentimes so do older voters. So even though they are voting at a higher rate, they might not make up a larger share of the electorate in some of these these elections. And I remember a quick story is that talking to a city councilman one time at a university I won't name, it wasn't Texas A&M, but it was a large state university, and the person said, I don't worry about the young voters because they won't vote. If they wanted to, they could take over the city council in this community if they registered to vote here, and they could completely control local government, but they won't. And so I don't worry about what they think or what they care about in terms of local politics, even when they come to me and complain. I listen to them, but I'm going to pay attention to the older voters who are more connected to the community. One thing that's changed, especially in terms of national politics, that's changed. A lot of candidates now are saying we do have to mobilize the younger vote. We have to think about the younger vote. We have to think about them as a bloc. We have to engage them. We want them to participate at a higher level. And then second, increasingly, at least in national politics, we've seen this division between the Democratic and the Republican Party to where now we're talking about a more coherent voting bloc that is more democratic and that is helping Democratic candidates and causes. 2018, there was a wide gap between Democratic and Republican voting. Same thing in 2020. One other thing just to think about, size matters. And these younger generations are large. I'm officially Gen X, though I just barely come in past the boomer cutoff. We're kind of a small generation. The boomers were a big generation, but the millennial and Gen Zs are a big generation. So they not only have weight because they are voting more as a bloc, they're more engaged than they've been in the past, but they also are a big group of voters.
I would like to add just one thing. I'd be curious, and we won't know this for probably several years, but I think the youth will crystallize over the student loan debate and the cost of college more than they would have said 20, so because as Dr. Goodell says, they don't necessarily have particular issues. I think we now have one where they might crystallize, at least from a certain part of the youth of that generation.
Yeah, so I'm a solid Gen X member, and it's interesting. Like so, and this may be something that group will recognize is like rock the vote. and that idea that this isn't just a kind of an automatic. I mean, there's a process involved, and so I mean, it's having the right to vote, but then the process of registering, of and you know, kind of invigorating that process. I mean, you know, older voters know the process. They've been through it. They understand it. And like you all have been saying, there's um, a certain level of predictability or an issue to vote. When you got to know what unpredictability of what will motivate the younger voters, and I really appreciate Dr. Monroe bringing up uh, the that you know, college education, college finance, and student loans, and a sort of economic motivation. I think that's always an issue that you never, you know, it's like economics have a way to motivate people. The pocketbook speaks volumes, but you know, given sort of that issue and um, climate change and healthcare. Certainly, you know, the last 18 months has just been unprecedented for for our generations. Um, there's, do you see other, you know, kind of parallels to the activism of the late 60s and early 70s that led to the you know, consensus of lowering the voting age, and even, you know, calls that have come recently to maybe even lowering it to 16, or in some ways trying to reinvigorate the process. I mean, we see that. I mean, like the process of registering, the process of voting itself is challenged. You know, and you see that there what are the similarities or you know, in the Generation X and the Millennial Z generations now.
You know, I do think, even though my expertise is more just the legislative process, the amendment process, one thing I can say where I do see some similarities are, it's not just student debt, it's home ownership. I recall during the presidential debates, the question was about home ownership. And I can tell you, we have 4 individuals in my family that fall in this age group, and home ownership is as important as student debt, and maybe the two combined. I think we also have, we're still dealing with racial equality issues. I mean, this has been a really strong issue that the younger generation is continuing to try to correct. And then we have issues of policing, right, that may disproportionately impact the younger generation. And so I think there are issues. I mean, I'm not sure there's been a time in American history where we had a lull that nothing could have motivated individuals, right? Wartime certainly is much higher, more potent motivator, particularly when we were sending individuals over to wars during the draft. Climate change, issues dealing with climate that, again, will probably disproportionately affect this voting population. But even then, it may not be enough to get past 50% of this block voting. And so maybe the difficulty for candidates is what does inspire individuals to vote. And even at our voting block, it could be a 1 issue, a 2 issue. It's not always clear, but there are some issues that I think the younger generation can coalesce around right now, both economic and then dealing with race equality.
Yep. No, I would agree with this. I mean, if you look at contemporary American politics, one of the great divides, the thing that we often talk about is polarization and partisan polarization, and party is such a clear and obvious divide. But the age divisions are really important, and they're important in ways that they haven't. I mean, there's always an age division between the young folks and the older folks, but these age divisions across a range of issues are really, really interesting. And you know, I go into my classes and say the kids are all right. It's us. We're the problem. The kids understand that, you know, the economy, the stagnation of wages is affecting them. It's affecting them in ways in terms of ability to pay off student loans. It's affecting them. The student loans affect the ability to pay for and to get houses. The housing and the student loans and everything together affects healthcare, and healthcare affects, and all of these things are combined in really, really important ways. And we deal with a set of political institutions in this country that make change very difficult when there's a demand for change. And so what I think we're seeing is among younger voters, this pent-up demand for serious economic change in this country that is finding a hard way to get expressed into policy because our political institutions, they're difficult. They're difficult to navigate, and they're difficult to push things through. And so it's fascinating to kind of watch where this goes. So in that way, the parallel to the 1970s is there. I think it's a different set of issues. It's a larger set of issues. It's not all sort of centered around mostly around anti-war. I think that's probably too much of a simplification, but I think it's a much broader set of issues, and it goes to the frustration of political institution and the frustrations with political elites. And so you're seeing a lot of engagement among younger voters, and they're engaged in a lot of different ways, partly through through voting and through regular, but also through activism, through consumer activism, through their choices and products. So anyway, I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I just want to add a little piece to that. I happen to work at an HBCU, so, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen at other universities, but I see that activism. I mean, we have students that are suing to be able to vote on campus. We have marches, we have things that I mean, I've worked at other universities that I just didn't see that degree of activism. Now, of course, this was several years ago, but I can certainly, it's just one university, but I'm sure it's happening everywhere. So I can speak to, I mean, I can give you plenty of examples of this activism that, it certainly happened in the 70s too, but it's just as active now as it was before.
So kind of speaking to that, and the what to vote for is, like you said, kind of there's clearly some really strong issues that have continued to be present, but maybe sometimes the who to vote for, that we've got such a the major parties have such a lock on the political process, and there's always calls for and occasionally third party or maybe sort of subgroups of the parties. Whether you have the Tea Party or the groups in the. Do you think that the youth vote kind of has influenced within the parties or for third and greater number of parties to develop? Is that sort of I don't know, say a realistic or potential expectation in the future or present?
So I think one of the challenges with the political parties is, we live in a two-party system. We have structural and institutional factors that encourage two parties and that make it more likely that we'll have two parties rather than a multi-party democracy. I personally would like to see us move in a way that would allow for more parties and more expression. One of the challenges with it, and one of the things I was talking about in terms of this pent-up demand for change and not getting fully expressed in policy, I think, is that there's sort of a natural distrust of the political parties among younger voters. I think it's sort of it's also progressive in the old sense of the word, not in the way we use it contemporarily necessarily, but a distrust of party and party organization. In order to really affect change, though, and I'm thinking really here and partly about sort of the Sanders movement within the Democratic Party. He's never become fully Democratic. If they really want to change the Democratic Party and they really want to change politics, they have to take over the party, and then they have to enact change through the party in the system that we currently live in. There seems to be some reluctance, some resistance to the idea that, you know, that parties are sort of bad and they're corrupting, but I think within our political system, you have to take over the political parties if you really want to enact change, and you can't operate from outside the party and try to change from outside. You have to ultimately get in and take over the party.
Yeah, again, policy is certainly not my expertise, but one thing I've seen even in the court system is a struggle with incumbents and a lack of term limits. If you look at the leadership in both the House and the Senate, it hasn't changed in quite some time. What happens is who's in the majority and who's in the minority based on who the president is. And those instances where states have done something in their own electoral process to try and put this candidate does not abide by term limits, or this candidate opposes term limits, those cases have been uniformly struck down by the United States Supreme Court, because just like with the earlier case that led to having an amendment focused on 18-year-old voters, the Supreme Court's basically explaining to society, if you want to have term limits, you cannot legislatively change the Constitution. You actually have to come in and have an amendment. And that would be true for judges and justices, or House of Representatives, members of the Senate. So I think that's a really important issue, is the power of the incumbent. I know Senator Grassley has just announced at age 88, he's running for another 6-year term in the Senate. And so when we think about the youth vote, their options, their choices are actually quite narrow because we are a two-party system. But the issue of incumbency and the issue of term limits is one that, if it's going to change, is likely going to have to be the next constitutional amendment we have.
Okay, I just want to step in. I sent a chat out that there's some technical issues, and Marisol's asked me to, if you, when we get to the Q&A, to send your questions to me instead, or just put them in the chat, and we'll try to, and we'll get those to our panelists. Yeah, so and throughout I was just also wondering, throughout these 50 years of not just the youth voting, but the idea of addressing how the process has been, I don't know, perceived. We've had just general the voter registration, motor voter, the process of opening it up. I mean, it is looking at the history of voting is throughout American history, obviously it's gradually expanded, and now we see sort of this contraction happening. And do you think that there needs to be a remedy of further expansion, or just maybe less constriction?
I'm glad to jump in. I think we make it too hard to vote in this country, but that's, I understand that other people have different concerns, and you have to balance sort of the ease with which someone's vote against the idea that someone might engage in voter fraud. But I think based on the evidence, we don't have much convincing evidence that voter fraud is a consistent and systematic problem. I grew up in a family where back in the day they went and bought pints of bourbon and passed them around and drove people to the polls. And so we know these things. We know things happen, and we know that there's a colorful, history in American politics of if not outright fraud, certainly organized efforts to to get people to the polls when maybe they might not have otherwise vote, short of the bourbon or the but why do we, in a world where we can go online and purchase a new vehicle or purchase a home without ever seeing it, or do all of these things that are so simple, why do we make it more difficult? And when we make it more difficult, there's been a lot of talk about the type of voters that increasing the burdens on voting and how this will affect certain groups of voters. Well, one of the groups that it's going to affect is college students, for sure, because they are, as we talked earlier, they're often influenced by short-term factors. There have been some great studies that look at first-time voters that suggest that a lot more of them intend to vote than actually turn out to vote. And why do they not follow through? Well, maybe I don't know where to go, or today's not the best day for it. And so if we can get them over that burden, we can get them to vote. And I think more voting is typically a good thing in a democratic political system. And so we should do things to reduce those burdens rather than increase those burdens. But we should also think about how increasing those burdens affect specific populations. We have a long history, though, of not making it particularly easy on college students for voting, for the reason that we didn't really want them to vote, because there was a question of would they vote where they're from, or will they vote in the college community, and some concern about how unpredictable they might be if they actually come in and vote in large numbers. So anyway, sorry, I'm beginning to ramble, so I'm going to stop.
I'll talk a little bit about the structural part of voting, which in our country, at the founding, voting requirements were left to the states. So nothing in the Bill of Rights gives any American the right to vote. And the 7 amendments dealing with voters, whether we're talking about the Electoral College and how we deal with electors, to eradicating poll taxes, because once we eradicated race as an impediment to voting, well, then poll taxes and literacy tests came up. So 7 of our 27 amendments to the US Constitution, 25% of the US Constitution is focused on voting. So structurally, that suggests that our country believes voting is perhaps the most important thing for all Americans. And yet you do see these laws sometimes making it a little more difficult, but they're uneven, right? Because in the 1970s and 1975, Congress realized that there were language problems. And so legislation was passed requiring that there was protection to people who didn't speak English. And in certain areas, you have to have voting access to protect language minorities. And then you get to the 1980s. And when we were dealing with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we realized that some disabled individuals had a difficulty in going and casting a vote, right? So that comes about. And then, as you said, in 1993, Congress passes the Motor Vehicle Act. So if you do go get identification, if you go in to sign up for your driver's license, there's a little box you check. Yes, I want to register to vote. And every time I go in to renew, I'm like, well, I'm registered. I know it's even confusing to me. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm like, but I'm already registered. So I always say, yes, I want to register to vote. So I feel like there are mixed messages. The greatest thing about the United States is really our freedoms and how we value our freedoms. Some countries you're required to vote. If you don't vote, you're taxed or you're penalized. Here you have that freedom. And yet some people don't even want to use that freedom, right? They don't think about the fact their grandmother couldn't vote. They don't think about, as Native Americans, they were not even given the right to vote until 1924, when we recognized them as full citizens, right? Our history is overcoming impediments to the right to vote. And yet here we are again. Here we are again, where this is a daily issue. And I will say, in the pandemic, it was, for me, really hopeful to see so many Americans go out and have their voice heard. I felt like people were saying that we know there's a pandemic, we know this is a difficult time, but we want to have our voice heard. And I saw a lot of people exercise that vote. Now, that is perhaps what is having some of this, okay, a lot of people are voting and maybe that not everyone wants to vote, but structurally, that is our system of government. And so I think that it's in the best interest of all people, all Americans, to have their voice heard.
So earlier, Dr. Monroe, mentioned that the campus climate at Prairie View, there's a lot of activism and protest and people, students expressing the frustrations over the accessibility of voting, or maybe even how they are, whether they're not allowed to vote or they feel like they're being disenfranchised. I'm wondering to the other panelists, do you sense that in your communities or a similar way, or is it just, or is it expressed differently? Do you see people sort of, there seems to be is there more of a status quo of voting and expectations in the especially the student populations?
I think in national elections, there's a high level of engagement. It's been nice at the law school. We've had voter drives to make sure we get voters registered. But I think there's a drop off even among all categories of voters in the more localized elections, right? The elections that ultimately tie into the national elections, like, for example, the census coming out and the redistricting, who serves us in Austin, Texas as Texans is really important. And I think this is not an issue related to age. I think it's just an issue of how do you motivate individuals to exercise this freedom. And sometimes there are things occurring in society that serve as that motivation, or we have a lot of voters who are really interested in a particular issue. But I would say at the law school, it feels like there's a high level of engagement, particularly during those national elections.
I mean, I guess my sense is, I don't know. It's hard to place it in a long term. I do sense the activism. I'm not sure, if we could measure it accurately, would we say the average level of activism has gone up? Probably yes, but certainly in terms of the groups that are ideological, that are politically interested and motivated, you see a lot more I feel like those groups are a lot more engaged than they have been in the past. I'm not sure that that affects across the entire student body, but the people who are motivated, engaged to be and politically interested are active at a level that's higher than I've noticed in the past. Whether that means the average student is or not, I don't know that I have a good read on that, but I do think there's a strong political current, and of course, it goes. I sense it on both the left and the right, maybe more on the left, because I do think that there's the younger voters today are more liberal and on a cross in a range of issues. But I also sense that there's more engagement on the right as well. So.
So we are reaching our last quarter hour, and serendipitously, we have a couple of questions, and we encourage anyone to, you can send one to me in the chat. So I'll start with this one because it maybe kind of follow up on Dr. Goidel. So why is it that that college students can't vote at their school? Why does college not qualify as a residence?
Well, I mean, they can That's a good question, but they can decide to have their residency if they decide to but they have to be a resident of one location versus the other. So, and so that's a challenge for many college students. They would rather be a resident of where they're from, where they think they'll ultimately go back to. And so voting in the local community is a challenge. And that's another challenge in terms of in terms of voting behavior, is that for a lot of college students, they need to get an absentee ballot. Now, as it turns out, when we eased up the rules in 2020 on absentee ballots, remarkably, more college students and more younger voters took advantage of those more flexible rules, as you would expect. So the more we can, wherever they want to vote, I think it partly depends on their sense of community and where they believe they belong and where they have a long-term stake. But certainly in terms of if we make it easier for them to vote either locally or through absentee ballots, we can improve voter turnout.
From a legal perspective, citizenship or residency in a state requires two things: a residence in fact, so you live in College Station if we're talking about the main campus of Texas A&M, but you have to have an intent to remain there indefinitely, right? And for a lot of college students, this also has to do with in-state tuition. So one of the things we look at is, where's your driver's license? Where's your car registered? Where is your quote unquote home, right? And so one of the reasons with college students, they're oftentimes transient individuals. I mean, I have a family member that's the University of Oklahoma with a Texas tattoo. Why? Because Texas is home. Now, that tattoo does not claim her citizenship, but her driver's license, her car registration, everything would let us know where she really is a resident. And I'm glad you brought up the notion of, how with absentee ballots and the ease of voting, we saw much higher participation. There are states in the United States, particularly on the West Coast, I think it's Oregon and Washington, that are only mail-in states. The only way, so there really isn't an excuse to vote, right? You have to mail in your ballot. So the other thing that I think it's important for all of us to understand, states set the voting process. How, whether you get to vote on the weekends, whether there's early voting, the hours, those type of things are being established from state to state. So there is no uniform election process in the United States. And that's largely because we have dual sovereignty issues. Passports are US government, driver's license is the state you live in. And with those dual sovereignties, states also run elections, and the Constitution gives them that authority. So it's a really tricky question, but as far as the question of citizenship, that's something you control. That's something you get to decide. Where is your intent to remain indefinitely?
Well, so this actually, first of all, thank you all so much. And this is like, you're leading like right into my next question, which is just beautiful. This is, so really, given, again, sort of, it's like this very procedural and this very, what's involved, what is a residency, what documentation do you have, and what does that mean? So, speaking to the recently passed voting law in Texas, and this, how the effect on voting rights, and what is the likelihood that they'll be challenged or even struck down by the courts?
I mean, it's hard to know, right? Because in litigation, you either win or lose. And the concern, I think, at the court level is, are you placing an impediment in the front of someone that would violate the Constitution or be similar to one of those impediments? Literacy status, poll tax, the grandfathering clause. But constricting the hours is something we do allow states to control, right? Because once again, we're the individuals who elect those representatives that go to Austin to make these decisions. And so part of this is this ongoing federalism debate. Do we want those decisions coming from Washington, D.C. as to how Texas votes? Or do we want those decisions coming from Austin? And that's a choice everyone gets to make for themselves. The Constitution tries to give us that balance. So I really don't know what the court's going to do with some of these issues. I mean, this United States Supreme Court probably won't step in if there's not a violation of one of our constitutional amendments or something that seems to take a protected class's ability to vote away from them.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. My suspicion. So these are. There's no question in my mind that the law was passed with the intention of keeping particular groups from vote. At least you increase the burden, and you don't have to increase the burden very much in order to discourage at least some people from voting, and that this was the intent of the law. But just because that was the intent doesn't mean that the burdens will be considered significantly enough to be significant enough that they require constitutional protection. And I think that's that's an interesting question, but one that's tougher, because as you said, a lot of these, we do set restrictions around all of these things. One of the other things, and I'm just gonna, this wasn't your question, but it makes me think of this. One of the things when people talk about voter fraud in this country, one of the most fascinating things is it's really not fraud that gets people. They don't understand why laws differ from state to state in many cases. And when you talk about some of these differences and you say, oh, this is the way Arizona, oh, this is the way Texas does it, oh, this is the way, a lot of people get really, what do you mean? What do you mean the votes aren't counted the same way from county to county within this country? What do you mean different election administration officials may behave differently in terms of how they engage with voters? And when you hear that kind of stuff, it's kind of shocking, the variance that is there. But we have resisted a single national standard because we like for voting to be decided by the states. We could potentially fix that by adopting a single national standard, but it runs against our ideas of federalism and the role of states in making these decisions. So one sort of final observation, which may be an unpopular take, but we thought Democrats might be able to take the Texas House in this last election cycle as part of the blue wave, and when they didn't, that allows for some of these voting things. So winning elections is sort of paramount to controlling voting processes, and especially winning elections at the state level. Republicans have done a very good job of focusing on state level elections and winning at the state level, and that puts them at advantage going into another topic that you may not, that may be opening another can of worms, but into redistricting processes. And so the reality is winning at the state level has given them control over a lot of these things, and that's unpleasant for at least Democratic voters and Democratic officials, and if you prefer more progressive policies, but it is the reality.
I just like to add a little something too, just to build on those points about polling. At least voter ID is seen as much more popular than it was, say, 5-10 years ago, because it's seen, what used to be seen might be as a poll tax or a literacy test is now seen much more favorably. It's that voter fraud argument as well, versus voter suppression. But also, I asked my freshmen, now of course you can take it for what you will, but over the last 10-15 years, I love asking my freshman American government college students, voting age 16, let's move it. And they're the first ones to say, no, they're too immature. Let me get this straight. They used to say, old enough to fight, old enough to, to die. And my argument, old enough to drive a car, old enough to vote. What's the problem? And they're the first one to say, no, they're not mature enough. I just find that incredibly ironic for a lot of reasons. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And and hearing from that population directly is incredibly insightful. Well, I know we're reaching the top of the hour. I do want to thank everyone so much for your participation. I really think this has been great. I want to share some information about. See if that's gonna. Can everyone see? What are you? Hopefully you're. Oh, I'm trying to say. Let me stop this. Not sharing what I thought I was going to share. Anyway, well, we have some. We had some voter registration information, and it's not quite working. But anyway, today at the Texas A&M College Station campus Memorial Student Center from 8 to 5, there is voter registration going on for National Voter Registration Day, which is today. And so encourage students, whether they're your classes or student workers, if they're not registered, they have this opportunity to do so on the College Station campus. It's interesting. Like I remember, just to end with a little anecdote. I mean, my parents are both poll workers. For a long time, my dad was a Republican poll worker, and my mom was a Democratic Party poll worker. So they figured they just evened it all out. And it was always that expectation of, this is what you do, this is what you vote. I think that's also a very powerful, say motivator, but this just that seeing that action, and that expectation it moves you. And I remember, taking my grandma, who could barely walk, and she would go to like the basement of a beauty salon and vote, and it was the back when they had the big curtain and you pulled the big lever, and just watching her, and just that was just sort of this fascinating process, and going from that. And I remember when I lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and it was when they first had early voting. And of course, the early voting was you could go to one place between the hours of 8 and 5, at the county clerk office, unless they were at lunch, and 2 weeks prior, ended 2 weeks prior to the actual election day. But I was like, oh well, I might as well do that. And I was telling my mom, and it was just like she was just sort of horrified. What, you don't vote on election day? I'm like, well, no, I don't have time to do that, but I could go during my lunch hour and vote early. And just I think these changes and these it's incremental is a process, and I think it's part of that sort of normalization of this activity and passing that along. Like I have a teenage son, and it's like, hey, come along, we're gonna go vote. You're my mom. Your mom's got to go vote. We're gonna do this. So I think that's another big part of the process, is just being, something that you do and you pass along to in your family, multi-generational. And I thank you all for passing along your knowledge and your insights, and thank you for everyone who has attended. And we will be sending out a survey. Is that correct, Marisol? She's nodding to me. I know she's had some issues with Zoom, some technical issues. So, but thank you for everyone for participating. We're past the hour, and I appreciate that. And hopefully we'll see each other again. So you all take care and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.